January 12, 1945. Okinawa Prefecture, Japan. The dawn breaks over the Pacific with the color of rust and ash. Volcanic rock stretches endlessly beneath a sky that refuses to lighten, as if the heavens themselves recoil from what is about to unfold. The air tastes of salt and sulfur. Somewhere in the distance, artillery thunder rolls across the water like the breathing of some ancient, terrible god. On the deck of a troopship cutting through dark waters, a young man from Lynchburg, Virginia, stands alone, his hands folded, his lips moving in silent prayer. He carries no rifle, no pistol, no blade. In his pack, a Bible worn soft from 1,000 readings, and a IKS kit that will soon be baptized in blood. His name is Desmond Thomas Doss, and he is about to step into a hell that will test every fiber of his faith. The invasion of Okinawa represents the final, desperate push toward the Japanese homeland. By early 1945, the calculus of war has become brutally simple. Every island conquered brings American forces closer to Tokyo, and every island conquered costs thousands of lives. Okinawa, that strategic jewel lying just 340 miles from mainland Japan, must be taken. The Pentagon knows this. MacArthur knows this. Every private boarding the landing craft knows this. What they do not yet know is that Okinawa will become the bloodiest battle of the Pacific Theater, a 3-month nightmare that will consume over 200,000 lives, military and civilian combined. And rising from the island's northeastern plateau, like a barrier between earth and sky, stands the Maeda Escarpment. The Americans will come to call it by another name, Hacksaw Ridge. 400 feet of sheer limestone cliff, honeycombed with caves and fortified positions, bristling with Japanese artillery and machine gun nests. A natural fortress that swallows men whole. The 96th Infantry Division draws the assignment to take it, and within their ranks marches Private First Class Desmond Doss, a medic who has already earned the suspicion, mockery, and eventual grudging respect of his company. He is a peculiar creature in this machinery of war, a conscientious objector who volunteered for combat, a Seventh-day Adventist who reads Exodus and Ezekiel while other men read letters from home, a man who interprets "Thou shalt not kill" as literal divine commandment, yet runs toward gunfire while others run for cover. The contradiction confounds his superiors. During basic training at Fort Jackson, South Carolina, his refusal to touch a weapon had nearly earned him a court-martial. His commanding officers tried everything to break him or discharge him: extra duties, harassment, psychological pressure. His fellow soldiers called him coward, weakling, preacher. They questioned his manhood and his patriotism in the crude language of barracks life. One night, several members of his unit cornered him, threatening violence if he didn't wash out and stop endangering them with his pacifist foolishness. Desmond Doss absorbed it all with a quiet dignity that only frustrated them further. But Doss possessed something his critics could not see, a faith forged in the fires of a childhood trauma that had marked him forever. Years earlier, in the modest frame house on Easley Street in Lynchburg, young Desmond had witnessed his father, Tom Doss, a carpenter and Great War veteran haunted by memories of the Western Front, pull a pistol during a drunken argument with his uncle. Desmond's mother placed herself between the two men, and Desmond, barely in his teens, managed to wrestle the gun from his father's hand. He ran with it to the police station, turned it in, begged them not to arrest his father. In that moment, staring at the blue steel weapon that had nearly destroyed his family, Desmond Doss made a covenant with God. He would never take a life. Not in anger, not in war, not ever. Yet when Pearl Harbor burned, when the nation called, something in Desmond Doss stirred. He understood duty. He believed in his country, in freedom, in stopping fascism's advance. He simply believed he could serve without killing, that he could preserve life rather than take it. This distinction seemed impossibly naive to the Army, but Doss held firm, citing his rights under conscientious objector provisions. Eventually, a compromise emerged. He would serve as a combat medic, unarmed, trusting in divine providence and the Red Cross on his helmet to protect him. What Desmond Doss expected was the opportunity to serve honorably, to prove that faith and courage were not mutually exclusive, to demonstrate that one could be both Christian and soldier in the truest sense. What he could not have expected was Hacksaw Ridge. April 29, 1945. The assault begins before dawn. The 96th Infantry Division moves out from the temporary positions they've clawed out of Okinawa's hostile earth. The plan is straightforward on paper. Scale the escarpment using cargo nets and rope ladders, establish a beachhead on top, push inland. In execution, it becomes a meat grinder. Japanese defenders have transformed the plateau into a killing field, with overlapping fields of fire covering every approach. The moment American helmets crest the ridge, machine gun fire erupts from a dozen concealed positions. Mortars begin falling with terrible accuracy. Men are cut down before they fully clear the ladders. Others make it onto the plateau only to be shredded by artillery they never see coming. Desmond Doss climbs the cargo net with his unit, his medic's bag bouncing against his back. Around him, men scream orders, curses, prayers. The noise is incomprehensible, rifle fire crackling like burning bamboo, the heavier chatter of machine guns, the shriek of incoming mortars, the wet sounds of metal finding flesh. He reaches the top and immediately drops into a shell crater as bullets snap through the air where his head had been a moment before. Smoke drifts across the plateau, thick and acrid. Through the haze, he sees shapes moving, falling, crawling. And then he hears it. Medic! Medic! The cry rises from a dozen throats at once, desperate and raw. Desmond Doss looks around at the chaos, at the impossible landscape of fire and death, and something settles over him. Not calm exactly, but purpose. He begins to move. For 3 days, the battle rages across Hacksaw Ridge. The Americans take ground in the daylight, lose it when Japanese counterattacks sweep across the plateau at night. The casualties mount with arithmetic brutality. The 96th Infantry Division bleeds itself against the escarpment's defenses, gaining yards at the cost of lives. And through it all, Desmond Doss works. He works with a single-minded devotion that transcends the logic of self-preservation. When his company is pinned down by machine gun fire, Doss crawls forward through the killing zone to reach a wounded man, drags him back to relative safety, applies tourniquets and morphine with hands that somehow remain steady. When mortars begin falling, he throws his body over the injured to shield them from shrapnel. He moves through smoke and fire with what witnesses will later describe as supernatural awareness, appearing wherever the wounded fall, often before other soldiers even realize someone has been hit. His fellow soldiers begin to see him differently. This strange, quiet man who refused to carry a weapon is running through fire to save them. The one they mocked, the one they called coward, is demonstrating a form of courage they cannot fully comprehend, a courage that doesn't rely on the power to kill, but on the willingness to die, so others might live. The records show that Desmond Doss treated and saved dozens of men during those first days on Hacksaw Ridge. He set up aid stations in shell craters, performed emergency procedures under fire, carried wounded men on his back through 100-yard dashes across open ground while Japanese bullets searched for him. Once he fashioned a rope stretcher and lowered men down the escarpment's cliff face one by one, a makeshift pulley system that allowed him to evacuate soldiers who could not climb down on their own. His refusal to carry a weapon meant he was always vulnerable, always at the mercy of whoever controlled the battlefield at any given moment. It also meant both hands were always free for his work. May 5, 1945. The Japanese launch a massive counterattack just before dawn, a concentrated push designed to drive the Americans off the escarpment entirely. Artillery falls like rain. The American line buckles, then breaks. Officers order a retreat, a fighting withdrawal back down the ridge to regroup and try again. The order spreads through the shattered companies, fall back now. But as the Americans begin their desperate scramble down the cargo nets and rope ladders, Desmond Doss realizes they are leaving wounded men behind. Not dead, wounded. Men still breathing, still conscious, still calling for help. Men who will be executed or left to die slowly when the Japanese retake the plateau. Every instinct of military training, every principle of survival says, retreat with your unit. You cannot help the dead, and you cannot save the lost. But Desmond Doss does not hear instinct. He hears the cries of wounded men, and he hears something else. A quiet voice in his soul that sound like his mother's prayers, like the verses he memorized from Isaiah, like the covenant he made as a boy holding his father's pistol. He stays. Alone on Hacksaw Ridge, with Japanese forces advancing through the smoke, Desmond Doss begins gathering the wounded. He finds a man with his legs destroyed by shrapnel, drags him to the escarpment's edge, fashions a rope harness around his chest, and lowers him down the cliff face. He whispers a prayer, "Lord, help me get one more," and goes back. He finds another soldier, unconscious and bleeding from a head wound, and repeats the process. Lower him down. Pray, "Lord, help me get one more." The mathematics of what happens next defy military probability. For hours, Desmond Doss works alone on the plateau, moving through a battlefield that belongs to the enemy, finding wounded Americans in shell craters and collapsed bunkers and scattered across open ground. He treats their wounds with supplies from his rapidly emptying medic's bag. He drags them to the cliff's edge. He lowers them down the escarpment one by one, his hands raw and bleeding from the rope, his body running on some fuel beyond adrenaline or strength. "Lord, help me get one more." He says it like a mantra, like a lifeline, like the only prayer that matters. Each time he saves a man, each time he lowers another broken body down to safety, he prays it again. "Just one more. Let me get one more." The Japanese soldiers sweeping across the plateau somehow do not find him, or perhaps they do not understand what they are seeing. This lone American with no weapon, wearing the medic's insignia, moving among the wounded with the dedication of a man in a trance. Some accounts suggest that Japanese troops, recognizing him as a medic, made the conscious decision not to shoot him, honoring the same battlefield conventions that marked medical personnel as theoretically non-combatant. Other accounts suggest pure miracle, that Doss moved through gaps in the enemy advance with timing too perfect to be mere luck. What is not in dispute are the numbers. When Desmond Doss finally descends from Hacksaw Ridge, when he rejoins his unit exhausted and bloody but intact, the count begins. How many men did the medic save? The soldiers he rescued claim 75. Doss himself, with characteristic humility, estimates 50. The official military record splits the difference, 75 men rescued under heavy fire, alone, over the course of approximately 12 hours. 75 lives preserved by a man who refused to take one. The story might have ended there, with Desmond Doss quietly rejoining his unit, continuing his work as the 96th Infantry Division ground through the remainder of the Okinawa campaign. But war writes its own narratives, and Doss's story on Okinawa contained additional chapters written in pain. On May 21st, nearly 3 weeks after his solitary rescue mission, Desmond Doss was caught in a grenade blast that drove shrapnel into his legs and body. He treated his own wounds, then waited 5 hours for stretcher bearers to reach his position because other men were wounded more critically and needed evacuation first. While being carried to safety, he spotted a soldier more severely injured than himself, rolled off the stretcher, and insisted the other man be taken instead. While waiting for the stretcher bearers to return, a Japanese sniper's bullet shattered his arm, the round splintering his bone and destroying tissue. Eventually evacuated to a field hospital, and then to medical ships, Desmond Doss left Okinawa, carried on the same type of stretcher he had used to save so many others. The wounds would plague him for the rest of his life. He would lose the use of one lung due to tuberculosis contracted during treatment, and his arm would never fully heal. But he survived, which was more than could be said for 12,000 American soldiers who remained on Okinawa forever. What transformed in those days on Hacksaw Ridge was not Desmond Doss. He remained the same quiet, faithful man who had boarded the troopship with a Bible in his pack. What transformed was everyone around him. The soldiers who had mocked him as a coward now understood they had witnessed a different kind of strength, the strength to remain defenseless in a place of violence, the strength to choose compassion when killing was easier, the strength to save life after life after life, when every rational impulse screamed to save yourself. His commanding officers, who had tried to have him discharged as a liability, now wrote commendations describing him as the bravest soldier they had ever known. The military establishment that had grudgingly tolerated his conscientious objector status now grappled with the reality that this unarmed man had accomplished more in a single day than many armed battalions accomplished in weeks. On October 12, 1945, with the war ended and the world beginning its slow return to peace, President Harry Truman stood in the White House and placed the Medal of Honor around Desmond Doss's neck. Doss became the first conscientious objector to receive the nation's highest military decoration. Truman, a combat veteran himself from the First World War, reportedly told Doss, "I'm proud of you. You really deserve this. I consider this a greater honor than being president." The citation read in part, he was a company aide man when the 1st Battalion assaulted a jagged escarpment 400 feet high. As our troops gained the summit, a heavy concentration of artillery, mortar, and machine gun fire crashed into them, inflicting approximately 75 casualties and driving the others back. PFC Doss refused to seek cover and remained in the fire-swept area with the many stricken, carrying them one by one to the edge of the escarpment, and there lowering them on a rope-supported litter down the face of a cliff to friendly hands. 75 casualties. One medic. No weapon except faith. The The symbolic weight of Desmond Doss's story resonates far beyond the specific horrors of Hacksaw Ridge. In his medic's bag, that simple canvas container holding bandages, morphine, sulfa powder, and tourniquets, resides a profound challenge to the logic of war itself. Where others carried 30 pounds of ammunition, the capacity for dealing death, Doss carried the tools of preservation. Where others trained to kill efficiently, he trained to save lives under impossible circumstances. The medic's bag becomes a symbol of an alternative approach to courage, one rooted not in domination but in service, not in power but in sacrifice. Consider what this meant to the men fighting beside him. American soldiers in World War II were products of a culture that celebrated strength, independence, rugged individualism. They had grown up on stories of frontier warriors and gunfighters, on the mythology of righteous violence defeating evil. The rifle was not merely a tool but an extension of American identity. The pioneer's long gun, the cowboy's Winchester, the doughboy's Springfield. To deliberately refuse that rifle, to step into combat without it, seemed to violate something fundamental about what it meant to be an American man. Yet here was Desmond Doss, embodying American courage in its purest form while simultaneously rejecting one of its central totems. He demonstrated that the values America claimed to fight for, freedom of conscience, moral conviction, the sanctity of individual belief, could exist even in the most extreme circumstances. His presence on Hacksaw Ridge testified to a democracy robust enough to accommodate dissent even within its military ranks, a system that could bend without breaking to include even those who fundamentally disagreed with the tools of war. The Japanese soldiers who witnessed Doss working among the wounded, who made the reported decision not to shoot him, recognized something that transcended national boundaries, the universal language of mercy. In a war marked by atrocities on both sides, in a Pacific campaign characterized by brutal close-quarters combat and racial hatred, Doss's actions represented a defiant insistence on humanity's persistence. The red cross on his helmet, that simple geometric symbol, carried weight beyond military convention. It declared allegiance to something older than nations, to the principle that even in war, some sanctities must be preserved. The transformation his story worked on American military culture cannot be overstated. Before Desmond Doss, conscientious objectors were generally relegated to non-combat roles, assigned to medical units far from the front, or given alternative service opportunities. The assumption held that deeply held religious convictions against killing were fundamentally incompatible with combat effectiveness. Doss shattered that assumption entirely. He proved that one could be both absolutely committed to pacifist principles and absolutely useful in war's most dangerous situations. He forced the military to recognize that courage came in forms that had nothing to do with how many enemies you killed. In the decades following World War II, as America grappled with increasingly controversial conflicts in Korea, Vietnam, and beyond, Desmond Doss's example provided a template for religious service members navigating the tension between faith and duty. His story became a touchstone in debates over conscientious objection, religious freedom in military service, and the proper treatment of soldiers whose beliefs diverged from institutional norms. He demonstrated that accommodation of conscience did not weaken military effectiveness. It enhanced it, adding dimensions of courage and moral clarity that pure martial prowess could never achieve. Yet, Doss himself remained profoundly humble about his accomplishments. After the war, he returned to Lynchburg, Virginia, married his sweetheart Dorothy Schutte, and lived a quiet life as a carpenter like his father before him. He rarely spoke of Hacksaw Ridge unless asked directly. When he did recount those days, he deflected praise away from himself toward divine intervention. "I was just a small part of a big war," he would say. "I was praying the whole time. I just kept praying, 'Lord, please help me get one more.'" In interviews later in life, Doss would describe the experience in simple terms. "I was just doing my job. I didn't feel like I did anything extraordinary. I felt like I was doing what I was trained to do." This matter-of-fact assessment from a man who saved 75 lives in 12 hours under constant enemy fire reveals something essential about his character. He genuinely did not perceive his actions as heroic. He perceived them as obedient. He heard men crying for help, and he helped them. The calculus was that simple. This simplicity contains profound depths. Desmond Doss reduced moral action to its essential core. When another human being suffers, you respond. You do not calculate the odds. You do not weigh your life against theirs. You do not question whether they deserve help or whether helping them serves strategic objectives. You respond because suffering demands response, because the man bleeding in the crater is your brother in the most fundamental sense, because to walk away would be to surrender something irreplaceable about what makes you human. The soldiers who witnessed his actions understood this at a visceral level. Many of them carried the memory of Desmond Doss for the rest of their lives, telling their children and grandchildren about the medic who refused to carry a gun, who saved them when everyone else had retreated, who embodied a kind of courage they had never imagined possible. They understood that they had seen something rare, a man who lived according to his principles without compromise, even when those principles seemed suicidally impractical, and who somehow not only survived but triumphed. The escarpment still stands on Okinawa. Maeda Escarpment, Hacksaw Ridge, that 400-foot limestone cliff, it remains, weathered by decades of Pacific storms, but fundamentally unchanged. The caves where Japanese soldiers sheltered still honeycomb its face. The plateau where so many died stretches away under the same sky that burned rust red that dawn in 1945. Tourists visit sometimes following battlefield tours that explain the tactical situation, the military units involved, the strategic importance. They stand at the escarpment's edge and try to imagine the horror of ascending into machine gun fire, of fighting across a killing ground while mortars fell like rain. But the full truth of what happened there, the miracle of one unarmed man descending again and again into hell to pull out the living, that truth exceeds the capacity of any tactical map or historical marker to convey. You would need to understand faith at its most fundamental level, faith not as abstract doctrine, but as lived reality. You would need to understand love not as sentiment, but as action in defiance of death. You would need to understand courage not as the absence of fear, but as the subordination of fear to purpose. Desmond Doss died on March 23, 2006, at the age of 87, his body finally surrendering to the wounds and illnesses that had plagued him since Okinawa. He was buried in Chattanooga National Cemetery with full military honors. Soldiers folded the flag that draped his casket with the same precision he had once folded bandages. A bugler played taps as the sun set over the Tennessee hills. But his story refuses burial. It persists because it speaks to questions every generation must answer. What does it mean to serve? What does courage look like? Can faith survive contact with evil? How do we honor our principles when the cost becomes unbearable? Is there such a thing as moral clarity in war's chaos? Desmond Doss answered these questions not with words but with action, and the answer resonates across decades. You can serve without killing. Courage is helping others when helping means your death. Faith not only survives contact with evil, it becomes most essential in that contact. Principles honored at impossible cost become transcendent. And moral clarity in war's chaos looks like a medic's bag, a rope, and a prayer repeated 75 times. Lord, help me get one more. In the mythology of World War II, we celebrate the warriors who stormed beaches and piloted fighters and commanded armies. We remember the generals whose names adorn theaters of operation, the admirals whose strategies won Pacific battles, the political leaders who forged alliances that defeated fascism. These celebrations are deserved. But we must also remember the man who climbed Hacksaw Ridge without a weapon, who lowered wounded men down a cliff face one by one while battle raged around him, who demonstrated that the highest form of strength is sometimes the refusal to kill. We must remember because Desmond Doss testified to a truth larger than war, that human beings are not defined by their capacity for violence, but by their capacity for mercy. That faith, when truly held and truly lived, can sustain us through the darkest circumstances. That every life possesses infinite value, worth saving at infinite risk. That the tools of healing, bandages and morphine, rope and prayer, matter more ultimately than the tools of destruction. On Okinawa's Maeda Escarpment, in the smoke and fire of May 1945, one man with a medic's bag and unshakable faith held the line between civilization and barbarism. He did not hold it with bullets or grenades. He held it with 75 individual acts of sacrifice, 75 moments of choosing another's life over his own comfort or safety, 75 times praying the same simple prayer. That escarpment still stands, but it stands transfigured. It is no longer merely a geographical feature or military objective. It has become a monument to what human beings can accomplish when they subordinate themselves entirely to service, when they value life absolutely, when they trust in something larger than the machinery of war. Hacksaw Ridge, where faith became action, where principle became heroism, where one unarmed man saved 75 lives, and in doing so, saved something essential about what it means to be human. The story endures because we need it to endure. In our own darkness, in our own battles against chaos and violence, we need to remember that another way exists, that courage can look like compassion, that strength can look like sacrifice, that victory can mean saving lives rather than taking them. Desmond Doss showed us that way. And the path he walked, that impossible path up cargo nets and across fire-swept plateaus and down rope lines weighted with wounded men, remains open for anyone brave enough to follow. The medic's bag still matters. The prayer still works. And somewhere across the distance of decades and the silence of graves, you can still hear it if you listen. That quiet, persistent voice refusing to leave anyone behind. Lord, help me get one more.